In August 1942, as German forces approached Stalingrad, Adolf Hitler issued an order that Wehrmacht operational commanders immediately recognized as dangerous. Stalingrad must be captured regardless of cost because the city bore Stalin's name. Professional military assessment was that Stalingrad had limited strategic value. It was an industrial city on Volga that could be neutralized by cutting river traffic without urban combat. Hitler rejected this analysis. He insisted that capturing city named for Stalin was political and psychological necessity that outweighed tactical considerations. Wehrmacht commanders warned that urban warfare would consume forces in time while providing no strategic advantage over simply bypassing the city. Hitler dismissed these concerns. The capture order was based entirely on symbolism. The city's name made it important in Hitler's mind regardless of its military value. That decision, to commit German forces to capturing city for symbolic reasons rather than strategic necessity, would trap an entire army in urban combat that professional judgment said was operationally pointless. This was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern that would repeat across German strategic decision-making. Symbolic importance of cities overriding professional military assessment of what operations required. Wehrmacht operational doctrine was clear about urban warfare: avoid it whenever possible because cities consume forces without providing proportional strategic advantage. Professional military planning prioritized operational objectives that disrupted enemy capability, transportation networks, industrial centers, supply lines. Cities were bypassed unless their capture was operationally necessary. German military tradition emphasized mobility and maneuver over attritional fighting. Professional staff officers were trained to assess objectives based on strategic value, not political symbolism. When Hitler began identifying cities as priority targets based on their names or symbolic significance, professional military staff raised immediate objections. They presented standard operational analysis. Does capturing this city accomplish strategic objective? Does urban combat provide advantage worth the cost? In most cases, professional assessment was negative. Cities that Hitler identified as important for symbolic reasons were not important strategically. Wehrmacht field commanders requested permission to bypass symbolic cities and focus on operationally significant objectives. These requests were systematically denied. Political and symbolic considerations were overriding professional military assessment of what operations required. German forces reached Stalingrad area in late August 1942. Wehrmacht operational staff presented alternatives to urban assault: encircle the city and cut Volga traffic, effectively neutralizing Stalingrad without committing forces to street fighting. This approach aligned with German operational doctrine about avoiding urban combat. Hitler rejected the alternative. He ordered direct assault to capture the city. His reasoning was explicit: the city's name made its capture politically necessary. Wehrmacht commanders objected. They calculated that urban combat in Stalingrad would consume divisions in attritional fighting while providing no operational advantage that encirclement would not achieve. Professional military assessment was that Stalingrad was becoming symbol rather than strategic objective. Hitler's response was that symbols mattered. Capturing Stalin's city would demonstrate German superiority and demoralize Soviet resistance. Professional military logic about operational efficiency was subordinated to political considerations about symbolic victories. The order was final. German forces would assault Stalingrad regardless of professional advice that alternatives existed serving strategic interests without urban warfare costs. German assault on Stalingrad began in September 1942. Street fighting was exactly as brutal as professional military assessment predicted. Every building became fortress. Every street was contested. German forces made incremental advances at enormous cost. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine emphasized mobility and maneuver. Stalingrad was antithesis of this doctrine: static, attritional urban warfare consuming forces without decisive results. By October, German forces controlled most of the city but had not eliminated Soviet resistance. Professional commanders reported that divisions committed to Stalingrad were being destroyed by attritional combat. They calculated that forces consumed in urban fighting could have been used for operationally significant objectives elsewhere. Wehrmacht requests to halt assault and revert to encirclement strategy were denied. Hitler insisted that complete capture was necessary. The symbolic importance of eliminating Soviet presence from Stalin's city overrode all operational considerations about force preservation and strategic alternatives. German forces continued urban assault through November. The city that professional assessments said should have been bypassed or encircled was consuming Germany's finest divisions in warfare that served no strategic purpose except symbolic victory. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus pincer attack that encircled German forces in Stalingrad. Wehrmacht operational staff had warned this was possible. They had identified that German forces concentrated in urban combat were vulnerable to envelopment. Professional recommendation had been to maintain mobile forces and avoid becoming fixed in city. Hitler's insistence on capturing Stalingrad for symbolic reasons had created exactly the vulnerability that operational doctrine warned against. Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was now trapped in city that professional assessments said should have been bypassed. Wehrmacht commanders immediately recommended breakout. German forces should abandon Stalingrad and retreat to avoid encirclement. Hitler refused. He ordered Sixth Army to hold Stalingrad regardless of encirclement. His reasoning remained symbolic. Giving up Stalin's city would be propaganda defeat. Professional military judgment was that army survival mattered more than symbolic cities. Hitler's priority was reversed: the symbol mattered more than the army. Operational reality was that Sixth Army was trapped because political obsession with city's name had overridden professional advice about avoiding urban warfare. Now symbolism was preventing escape that doctrine required. After Stalingrad disaster, Hitler formalized his symbolic city obsession through military policy. In 1943–44, he designated numerous cities as fortress cities that must be held regardless of tactical situation. Wehrmacht commanders recognized this as institutionalizing exactly the mistake that destroyed Sixth Army. Professional military doctrine said forces should conduct mobile defense, trading space for time and avoiding encirclement. Fortress city policy required forces to remain in fixed positions even when enemy encircled them. Operational logic said this guaranteed destruction of defending forces. Political symbolism said holding cities demonstrated determination. Professional staff officers objected strenuously. They presented historical analysis showing that static defense in cities led consistently to force destruction. They calculated that mobile operations would preserve forces while accomplishing same defensive objectives. Hitler rejected professional advice. His fortress city policy was explicit: certain cities would be held because of their political and symbolic importance regardless of military cost. Wehrmacht was now institutionally required to repeat Stalingrad's mistake across entire Eastern Front. Professional military expertise about defensive operations was being systematically overridden by political policy treating city names as more important than force preservation. As fortress city policy was implemented, Wehrmacht field commanders faced impossible choice: obey professional military doctrine about mobile defense, or obey Hitler's orders about holding symbolic cities. Numerous commanders chose doctrine. They conducted tactical retreats from cities when encirclement threatened, preserving forces for continued operations. Hitler relieved these commanders for disobeying fortress city orders. Professional officers who made operationally sound decisions based on military doctrine were removed for refusing to sacrifice forces for symbolic objectives. The message to Wehrmacht was clear: political symbolism took absolute priority over professional military judgment. Commanders who wanted to preserve their careers learned to obey fortress city orders even when professional assessments said those orders guaranteed force destruction. This created systematic dysfunction where operational competence was punished and political obedience was rewarded. Wehrmacht was losing its best field commanders because they prioritized force preservation over city names. The remaining commanders understood that professional military expertise was secondary to political loyalty. Germany's military effectiveness was being deliberately degraded by policy that institutionalized symbolic obsession over operational competence. In December 1944, Soviet forces encircled Budapest. Wehrmacht commanders requested authorization to withdraw. Budapest was fortress city. Hitler ordered it held. Professional assessment was identical to Stalingrad situation: forces were trapped in urban defense serving no strategic purpose. Wehrmacht operational staff presented detailed analysis showing Budapest defense would result in force destruction without affecting Soviet advance. Hitler rejected analysis. Budapest's symbolic importance as Axis capital required holding it regardless of cost. German and Hungarian forces remained in Budapest through winter. The siege was exact repetition of Stalingrad urban warfare, consuming forces for symbolic objective. In February 1945, Budapest garrison was destroyed attempting to break out. Over 100,000 Axis troops were killed or captured. Professional military commanders who had warned this would happen noted bitterly that Stalingrad had taught nothing. The symbolic city obsession was unchanged. Wehrmacht forces were still being sacrificed for city names rather than preserved for strategic operations. The pattern established at Stalingrad in 1942 was continuing unchanged in 1945 despite its proven catastrophic consequences. Political symbolism remained more important than professional military judgment about force preservation. In early 1945, Soviet forces encircled Königsberg in East Prussia. Wehrmacht garrison requested evacuation. Königsberg was fortress city and also symbolic as historic Prussian capital. Hitler ordered it held. Professional assessment was that Königsberg defense served no operational purpose. Soviet advance into Germany would continue regardless. Wehrmacht calculated that forces trapped in Königsberg could be evacuated and used for defense of German heartland. Hitler refused evacuation. Königsberg's historical significance required defense. German garrison held through April 1945. The defense accomplished nothing strategically. Soviet forces bypassed Königsberg and continued westward. Garrison was destroyed in final assault. The forces wasted defending symbolic city for 3 months could have been defending approaches to Berlin. Professional military staff noted that Königsberg exemplified the complete triumph of symbolism over strategy. A city was defended because of its name and history while operationally critical objectives were abandoned. The pattern was unchanged from Stalingrad 3 years earlier: political obsession with symbolic cities overriding every professional military consideration about how to conduct defensive operations effectively. Wehrmacht post-war professional analysis examined pattern of fortress city disasters. Staff officers calculated total forces lost defending symbolic objectives: Stalingrad, Damayansk, Budapest, Königsberg, and numerous other fortress cities cost Germany well over 1 million troops. These were not combat losses achieving strategic objectives, they were forces deliberately sacrificed for political symbolism. Professional assessment documented that in nearly every case, mobile defense would have preserved forces while achieving same defensive results. The analysis was damning. Political obsession with city names had systematically destroyed German combat power. Every fortress city decision followed same pattern. Professional military staff recommended mobile operations, Hitler ordered static defense for symbolic reasons, forces were encircled and destroyed. The pattern never changed despite repeated catastrophic results. Professional expertise had been systematically ignored in favor of political symbolism. The analysis calculated that if forces wasted in fortress cities had been available for mobile operations, German defensive capabilities in 1944–45 would have been substantially stronger. Germany did not lack professional military expertise about defensive operations. Germany lacked decision-making structure that implemented professional expertise when it conflicted with political leaders' symbolic obsessions. Wehrmacht field commanders who served during Fortress City period provided consistent testimony. They recognized Fortress City orders were operationally catastrophic but could not disobey without being relieved. Commanders described receiving orders to hold cities while professional assessment showed defense was impossible and would result in forced destruction. They presented alternatives to higher command: mobile defense, tactical retreats, force preservation. These alternatives were rejected based on cities' symbolic importance. Commanders were told explicitly that holding cities mattered more than military effectiveness. Some commanders disobeyed and were relieved. Others obeyed and watched their forces be destroyed. All recognized the dysfunction. Professional military competence was subordinated to political symbolism. Field commanders had expertise and authority to conduct operations effectively, but political policy prevented implementing that expertise. The testimony was unanimous. Fortress city policy was recognized as catastrophic by professional military officers but could not be changed because decision authority rested with political leadership unwilling to prioritize operational effectiveness over symbolic objectives. Wehrmacht had expertise to conduct effective defensive operations. Political system prevented using that expertise when it conflicted with leaders' obsessions. Hitler's symbolic city obsession was not limited to major fortresses. The pattern appeared at every operational level. Battalion commanders received orders to hold villages because of their names. Regimental commanders were ordered to defend crossroads because Hitler had identified them on maps. Division commanders could not conduct tactical retreats because specific locations had become symbolically important. Professional military officers at every level reported same dysfunction. Operational decisions were being made based on political symbolism rather than tactical necessity. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized decentralized command where field commanders made tactical decisions based on local conditions. Fortress city policy and related symbolic obsessions centralized tactical decision-making under Hitler, who made choices based on map reading and political considerations rather than operational reality. The result was systematic degradation of German tactical effectiveness. Commanders could not employ professional expertise because political leadership was micromanaging operations based on symbolism. Germany lost not because Wehrmacht lacked tactical skill or professional expertise, but because decision-making structure prevented implementing that expertise. Symbolic obsessions overrode professional judgment from strategic level down to battalion tactics. Every level of command reported same pattern: political symbolism was more important than military effectiveness. Soviet military intelligence identified Hitler's symbolic city obsession as exploitable weakness. Soviet operational planning deliberately targeted cities they knew Hitler would order defended. When German forces predictably concentrated in urban defense, Soviet forces encircled and destroyed them. The pattern was consistent: Soviets would threaten fortress city, Hitler would order static defense, Wehrmacht forces would become fixed, Soviet envelopment would trap them. Soviet commanders understood they could reliably predict German operations by identifying which cities Hitler considered symbolically important. This gave Soviets enormous operational advantage. Wehrmacht mobile warfare doctrine emphasized unpredictability. Fortress city policy made German operations completely predictable. Professional Wehrmacht staff recognized this. They documented that Soviets were deliberately exploiting Hitler's symbolic obsessions to destroy German forces. They presented analysis showing that abandoning fortress city policy would restore operational unpredictability and force Soviets to adapt. Analysis was ignored. Hitler insisted fortress cities must be defended. Soviet operational planning continued exploiting this predictable pattern. Germany had handed its enemies reliable method for destroying German forces by making operations predictable based on leaders' symbolic obsessions that overrode professional military flexibility. Military historians analyzing German defensive operations 1943-45 consistently examine counterfactual: what if Germany had followed professional military doctrine about mobile defense rather than fortress city symbolism? Wehrmacht expertise in mobile warfare was world-class. Professional staff had comprehensive doctrine for defensive operations, trading space for time while preserving forces. If this expertise had been implemented, conducting mobile defense, avoiding encirclements, prioritizing force preservation over holding locations, German defensive capabilities would have been substantially more effective. The counterfactual is calculable. Forces lost in fortress cities, over 1 million troops, would have been available for mobile operations. Soviet advances would have faced stronger, more flexible resistance. German defensive campaign would have been more effective and prolonged. This does not suggest German victory. Soviet resources and Allied cooperation ensured eventual German defeat. But the manner of defeat was affected by fortress city policy. Germany collapsed more rapidly and completely because forces were systematically destroyed in symbolic urban defense rather than preserved through mobile operations. Professional military expertise existed to conduct effective defense. Political obsession with symbolic cities prevented implementing that expertise. The counterfactual shows cost was measurable: approximately 1 million troops and substantially reduced defensive effectiveness across entire campaign. When historians assess German strategic failures, symbolic city obsession appears consistently as systematic dysfunction where political considerations destroyed military effectiveness. Pattern was clear from Stalingrad through war's end. Hitler identified cities as important based on names and symbolism. Professional military staff assessed cities had limited strategic value and static defense would destroy forces. Hitler ordered defense regardless of professional advice. Forces were encircled and destroyed. Pattern repeated dozens of times with identical results. Professional military expertise correctly identified that symbolic cities should be bypassed or defended flexibly, but political decision-making prioritized symbolism over operational effectiveness. The cost was catastrophic: over 1 million troops lost defending symbolic objectives serving no strategic purpose, systematic degradation of German defensive capabilities by making operations predictable, punishment of competent commanders who followed professional doctrine, and institutionalization of dysfunction where political symbolism took absolute priority over military effectiveness. Germany possessed professional military expertise about urban warfare, defensive operations, and force preservation. Wehrmacht doctrine was sound and commanders were competent. Germany lost partly because political system prevented implementing professional expertise whenever it conflicted with leaders' symbolic obsessions. Stalingrad was not aberration, it was template that was deliberately repeated because political structure valued city names more than army survival. Professional military judgment was systematically overridden by symbolic considerations until defeat was complete.